Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and all of us who are neither and or both, welcome to today's panel. Tomorrow's history is going to be so queer, a panel on queer oral history presented by the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project. My name is SL Ziegler. I'm the oral historian for said project, and I'm honored to be the moderator for today's conversation. Before we get started, I have just a couple of announcements to make. First up is a bit of housekeeping. We'll do our best to have a Q&A at the end of the session today. So please do use the chat to ask questions, and I'll do my best to get them all read out for our panel. I'll also remind you that we all agreed to the code of conduct, which, when registering for this, which states in part harassment of participants would not be tolerated in any forum. Sometimes things happen, and if it looks like we have a problem that we can't contain, the panel participants have kindly agreed to record this conversation without a live audience, and we'll send a link out to a recording afterwards. Excuse me. No one wants that, of course, but life is just too short, y'all, to put up with this nonsense. All right, let me also plug our next panel coming up in just 4 weeks from today on April 8th, 2021. We'll be gathering to talk about using oral histories in the classroom. We do, after all, want these to be useful and used. This will be great. You can find information about all of this on our website, and you can read more about each panelist and register, and I certainly hope that you do. I also want to point out that we have a growing collection of past programming that you can watch and rewatch through our website, including my conversation with Kat Jacquet, historian at LSU, who schools me on the history of trans history and the role of trans liberation that it takes. We call it How Do We Get in All Those Fancy Books? A conversation on the history of trans history. It was good fun. I hope you take a look. Additionally, you'll be able to find our previous panel from last month, Storytelling and the Preservation of Our Trans History, a community panel. This one was moderated by the very, very talented Camilla Marchina and was absolutely delightful. Watch, rewatch, tell your friends. And another thing that you can find on our website is a growing collection of full interview transcripts. We are building a record of what it means to be trans here in Louisiana in the early 21st century. And it's the type of thing that I sorely wished I had when I was younger. And I'm so happy to be able to provide it to others. And finally, a thank you to our funders. Today's panel and so much of the programming I've mentioned already is only available to us because of the funding from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Allow me to read this to you. This panel, I should say, is funded under a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, which is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this panel do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment of the Humanities, which is to say they in no way are guaranteeing that tomorrow's history will be so queer. Let me go ahead and stop my sharing now so we can get back and be able to see all of our friendly, beautiful faces. And at this point, I'm going to pause and let our panelists introduce themselves. The five of us discussed this before, and we're going to go alphabetically, so by last name. So Myrl, let me go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to see everybody's faces and or avatars or whatever. I'm excited to be in conversation with everybody today. My name is Myrl. I work on a project called the Treader Trans Oral History Project, which existed before me. I came into the second phase of the project. It has now about 250 oral histories with trans folks. And fairly soon, I will drop a link into the chat where you can check out the project. Before I was the oral historian on this project, which I started working on in 2019, I am also an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, and also teach queer oral history and trans oral history classes at Macalester College while I'm working on the oral history project. Yeah, that's me. And I write and work around queer and trans social movement politics. So I have a book that I wrote about that called Gay Inc., The Nonprofitization of Queer Politics. But really that was part of my interest in the oral history project is talking with trans movement leaders really about like what are their visions for a different world, for a world that's less structured by racialized gender norms, and what are the sort of debates and strategies about how to get there. And how do we think about trans movements as not being about like bathrooms and rights, and really being about like remaking the world and reimagining ways of being in it? So yeah, that's me.
All right, I'm up next. So I'm Aiden Bateen. I'm based in Iowa City. So shout out to all the Iowa City folks. Exciting to see many folks I actually don't know. And so chat with me after this. But I run a number of projects. One is the LGBTQ Iowa Archives and Library, which is a new community archives here trying to capture the history of queer life in Iowa broadly. And it now houses the project I've been running for a few years, which is the Transgender Oral History Project of Iowa. And so that project I really direct. I don't essentially call myself the oral historian, and you'll hear about some of those reasons during this panel, but it's a community-led project where trans folks are interviewing one another and empowered to sit and do that work. I am also an archivist on the University of Iowa's campus. I'm the community and student life archivist as of January, so it's been 2 months, which is a really fabulous overlap in a lot of the work on local history and underrepresented communities in institutional archives here on our campus. So I overlap in all of those roles with the communities I work with, but it just means that I really prioritize Iowa's history and Iowa's queer history in a number of contexts. So I'm happy to talk about that with you all today.
All right, my name's Rae. I have recently moved back home to Southern West Virginia, where I grew up, from Southeastern Kentucky in the coal fields. And I founded in 2013, with no real training or experience, this project called Country Queers to try to find and meet and learn from and connect with other rural queer people who I'd never heard about or like seen in all of my, at that time, 27 years. And so since then, the project has grown. It includes maybe 70 something interviews. There's a gallery exhibit. There are ongoing Instagram takeovers. And in June of last year, we launched season 1 of the podcast. And so it is very much a sort of learn as you go, inching along, little DIY rural Central Appalachian based project. And if my internet goes out, speaking of, I apologize, but hopefully my connection is all right. And I'm so excited for this conversation with all of y'all.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm really excited about learning from this conversation. I'm Amy McDowell, and I'm associate professor at the University of Mississippi in sociology. I was not trained as an oral historian. I have more of a training in qualitative interviewing, and that tends to be much more private kind of data collection. It's not so public facing. So that realm of this kind of work is somewhat new for me. I joined this project in 2019, and in some ways the Invisible Histories Project Mississippi really started in 2019 as well. I would term myself the director of Queer Mississippi Oral Histories Project, but I do want to give a shout out to the graduate students who do a lot of the interviewing work. One of those students I know is here. Danielle Buckingham has joined the session today, and Hooper Schultz has also been a big part of the project, as well as MJ Shapley. So I'm going to use we a lot as I'm talking about our work, because I really feel it's a team project. And in terms of my kind of teaching world and what I do on a day-to-day basis, I teach courses in religion, gender, and sexuality. I tend to do a lot of intersectional work in that regard. And my research both looks at gender and sexuality, and then there's this other part of me that looks at conservative Christianity and how that shapes our day-to-day lives, whether or not you are a conservative Christian or not.
Yeah, thank you all so much for that. It's so great to hear everyone's different project and how it's configured. Speaking of DIY, the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project started because I was lonely during the pandemic. So I'm always so glad to see how all these different ones get started. And I think it might be a good place to start. Here might be with a few words about who our audience is, right? So the subtitle of our panel is about queer oral histories. And I'm interested in how you define the community of your project. For instance, who falls within the scope of it, and how you ensure that your project is accountable to this community. And also, because compound questions are always such a good idea, what does accountability look like for your project? And Rae, maybe we'll start with you for that.
All right. Well, I mean, it's been 8 years, and it's a project that I've mostly been able to work on, a few hours here or a weekend here, or 2 weeks when my job was out over there. And so I think some of this is like, has been developed not super consciously with a lot of time to plan, but just through like working along the way. But when I initially started the project in 2013, if you Googled like rural and queer or small town and gay, I mean, there was just really kind of nothing. There were a couple academic books. There was like one article by someone who'd grown up in Georgia but lived in New York City that was not academic. And there was a project called I'm from Driftwood that did some like video interviews, short things with people. And other than that, it was like the only mainstream media there was about rural queer experience was, I'm blanking on the name of the movie, Boys Don't Cry. And of course, conversations about Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming. And so when I started it, I think like, I really needed it. I like, same as what you're saying, SL, like I was really isolated. I had moved home to West Virginia. I didn't know how to make it work. I was really happy to be home. I didn't want to leave, but I also was like, I can't have all my queer friends be in New York and Austin and the Bay while I'm living and working in public schools that I went to growing up in like rural Southern West Virginia. And so I say that because I don't think I knew who the audience was. I didn't actually think there was going to be an audience, I guess, is the thing. I didn't think it was going to work. I didn't think anybody was going to fund it. I didn't think anybody was going to listen to it. And then as I started to gather stories, and like mostly through other country queers I interviewed, people were really excited to read the transcripts. Clearly, very quickly, like for me, this is like for rural queer people by rural queer people. And that I sometimes have to like come back to, especially since launching the podcast, because I think it can be really hard to measure like success with the podcast, like who's listening, how do we know we're doing a good job? You know what I mean? And so at a few points this summer, I had to just sort of remind myself, like, it's great if anybody who wants to listen, please do. And like, if I'm getting feedback from rural queer people who I've interviewed, who I haven't, but that this is like helpful in some way for their life as rural queer people, then I feel like that's how I'm sort of measuring it. And I would say though that like rural queers is like I think we do this a lot where we're like queer community, trans community, right? And like what does that even mean? Like it's so big. Like experiences are so different across different layers of identity, including like race and class and gender expression and occupation and religion, right? And so I think that it's kind of, it's good to have that overall marker, but I would say that where this shows up most like concretely is that from the beginning, I just, without really formal training, but I was like, I am not going to post anybody's story anywhere without them having at least one round of like going through and removing anything or saying, I don't want this to go anywhere at all, right? So my main priority, I would say, is to the people that I interview, that like, it's very important to me that they understand that it's clear to them that like, I will check in with them and try to get consent in like as many moments as I can along the way. And I've had people who like, years later were like, I just don't feel like this is relevant anymore. And so it's not a part of the project, that's public. And so, but I will say that producing the podcast this summer, it became a little like pretty quickly I realized, the main priority is that the person who's sharing their story feels really comfortable with how it's represented. And in a project that's trying to really complicate conversations about rural spaces and where queerness can thrive, I just found, and that launched right this past summer during COVID, during Black Lives Matter protests across the country, just like all of the violence that we've seen, all of the death that we've seen. I thought a lot about a really brief conversation that I had with Suzanne Farr, who's one of the founders of Southerners on New Ground, years ago when I'd first started the project. And she sat down with me, and she's done a lot of rural organizing across the South and the country. And she was like, you know, who are you accountable to in this work? And in particular, how are you accountable to people of color in this work? And I think about that a lot with this project. So all of that is to say, you know, part of what we tried to do in each episode was like to put the individual interview in the context of what was happening in the moment when it was recorded. So that there's a little bit about like things that might not come up in the interview, but that are shaping the time. And that also maybe gets into like some other experiences of that place and that time that may not be expressed in the interview itself. That was a bit of a ramble. We also did an episode on Country Queers with the editorial advisory team about this that you can find on our feed.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rae. I appreciate it. It's a big and I think very important topic. Hey, Amy, can I bounce the same question over to you?
Yeah, sure. And I think I really like how Rae talked about community and how that defining that term. When I first read your question, SL, I spent a lot of time with that question, was community and then accountability. Those are two really big things to kind of wrap one's mind around. But I guess if I were to summarize how that we as a project team define community as people who are LGBTQ plus Mississippians and those who advocate and fight for the well-being of LGBTQ plus Mississippians. In terms of accountability, to Rae's point, we're taking informed consent very seriously. So we're very clear with participants from the front end about how their interviews will be stored and made public and the potential risks that come with participating in an oral history project. And we're doing that storing or archiving here at the University of Mississippi in a state that has no good reputation for the well-being of LGBTQ individuals, and has passed egregious laws in just recent years, since 2016 with House Bill 1523 as one of the starting bills that protects sincerely held religious belief that someone can discriminate on the basis of gender and sexuality. So being in this kind of institution, it's really about taking seriously what that means for people to have their life stories housed in an institution that is this state's flagship university. And so that's how we also got connected with Invisible Histories Project, was so that Invisible Histories Project would also have ultimately the ownership of these archives, so that if something were to happen here at this university in this context, that there's kind of a safeguard and safe place that those interviews would be part of. The other thing is, letting people know, as Rae said, having people read those interview transcripts, that they get that final read is very important. It's an important step in accountability, to make sure that the person knows what they, can reflect on what they shared and stick to whether or not they want that to continue to be shared. We're also very clear that if someone doesn't want to ask a question that we ask, that they don't have to answer it. And I think that's important to say out the gate, because there is, no matter how much conversation and rapport we try to build, there's a power dynamic when you're the one with the recorder, and someone can feel like they're obligated to go into something that they might not feel comfortable doing so. In terms of accountability for the community more broadly, I was thinking about how that we hadn't really talked about accountability explicitly as a team, but that we are talking quite a bit about how do we facilitate community engagement? How do we get this project beyond the walls of a university? How do we make it accessible to people in rural places who would never step foot in Oxford, Mississippi, who would not feel comfortable here? And so one of the things that we did right at the beginning of the launching of this project is we participated in Tupelo Pride event. It was only their second year of having a Pride event. Tupelo is a small town that has the American Family Association headquarters there. having a pride gathering was a tough challenge for those who organized that event. And so what we did is we took some snippets of oral history interviews of people that were there and participating in Pride and had participated in our project, and we made ethno-poems out of those. So we hung those around the walls. We did an exhibit of a record collection by DJ Charles Smith, who DJ'd at various gay bars throughout the state in the 80s and 90s. And that was a way for us to get outside of Oxford, and we plan to do that a lot more. We really enjoyed that event. We were able to make a lot more relationships and connections with people that way, and it made this work really fulfilling. Of course, with COVID, some of those plans for doing that kind of stuff has been stunted, but we definitely have big goals of returning. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Amy. Aiden, maybe I'll jump over to you because you also have, like Amy, you have sort of a state, excuse me, a state focus. So maybe if you have any thoughts on the same topic.
Yeah, I think Rae and Amy have both really highlighted the way that consent in this work is a process, and that there are multiple points with which we can invite people to share how they're feeling, to put a pause on something, to make something private, and to have that autonomy over how their narratives are accessible. And so the Trans Oral History Project, I can't help but start here in terms of accountability. We use an Indigenous archiving platform called Mukatu. I wish we had an archive to show you, but I'll chat the link there. That allows various levels of access. So there's a public-facing aspect to the archive, there will be, and then there's 3 other layers. One is conceptualized as a research layer, where maybe people could share more about their kind of metadata in terms of their personal life, like their age, what town they're actually in if they don't want that public, or other things. If someone wanted to do trans history research in Iowa, this kind of like trust that this would be a good project, a researcher would kind of have to quote unquote apply to the archive and share what their project is for us to kind of unlock and invite them into that part of the archive. There's 2 more layers. One is just community. And this works kind of like a social media profile where people would sign up and fill out their identity terms, but this is all private, right? If you were a user of the archive, and then be able to access the kind of transgender, nonconforming, non-binary only space in this archive where people can cut out their narratives and oral histories and break them apart and say, oh, this part's public, this part's for just community. And then a 4th layer where, you know, if I was interviewed and I said, you know, I only want other trans men or trans masculine folks, someone who share my terms and experience, to hear this part. It could be literally that, made that granular. We have the affordance to do it. Now, from some of the early interviews that we've done that aren't quite online yet, we haven't even been able to take advantage of all these affordances. This isn't, people want to share their stories. So this is an accountability and kind of safety and privacy mechanism, but that doesn't mean that people are going to take advantage of it as narrators, which I find really intriguing, but I'm glad that we have the option. And then the other note, just in terms of kind of community, we broadly, you know, ask and invite anyone to participate in the project if they identify as part of the transgender, nonconforming, non-binary community and have some affinity to Iowa. Now, it could be they stop in Iowa for a talk and we get a chance to interview them, or they're Iowan born and raised. So it really is that spectrum of whatever relationship you have to Iowa and you're part of the community, we want to interview you. And so that's the community we prioritize and center in the work that we do in terms of training people to conduct interviews and actually hosting the interviews. But of course, I think it just kind of balloons out in terms of priority. So the safety and engagement and reflection of the trans community is the first priority, right? People want to see themselves existing. And I think that's something that's already been echoed that we've all wanted to know, right? And see ourselves in history and see ourselves in the contemporary moment. So that's like our first point of offering, is to other trans Iowans and trans Iowan youth in particular who've been so attacked this legislative session, to let them know like we're here too, and you can see us and have that reflection. But then it runs through to the public, right? Anybody who can learn and have an educational opportunity to understand the trans experience, this becomes a resource and an archive for that work. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's definitely one of the big foci I think my project and so many others. Myrl, let me just ask you if you also would like to weigh on the same topic.
Yeah, I mean, our project shares many of the same approaches in terms of the rolling consent process at every stage, and a process in which we ask participants to share how they would like to be described and review at all stages. But the first part of the question actually is one that's really interesting to me, around how we identify community, and in particular doing a trans oral history project in a political context in which a lot of work is happening at a lot of different levels to try and pin down the meaning of trans. I feel a special sense of purpose around making sure that an oral history project doesn't do that work for the people who are trying to do that in ways that limit the richness and conflict around what that means. I'm a firm believer that it's super important that not everyone needs to agree on what trans is, that we can do a project around fabulous gender embodiment, and some folks can think that trans is something in their brain. That's cool. I don't think that. We don't need to, and it's super important to me that our oral history project, in the interviews itself and in the way we describe them especially, doesn't try and participate in what are already super normative ideas about, I experienced intense gender dysphoria as a child. I was always playing with G.I. Joes / makeup, depending on sex assigned at birth, and this very normative trans narrative that feels super true for some folks, but also is sort of imposed coercively by the medical system with which a lot of us have to engage in order to access gender affirming medical care. And so it's felt really important to me to just treat a lot of care in making sure that we keep really open our sense of what trans is and means and feels like, in part because trans itself is a super recent way of describing gender nonconformity, and it's bounded in time and space and place. It's not a true for all time way of describing gender nonconformity, right? And so I want to create space for folks who come from different cultural frames, for whom trans is not their way of talking about their gender experience. And yet still creating space to do the work of making visible stories that have been excluded from the archive, or an archive that's only talked about gender nonconformity in terms of a problem to be solved. So that's not exactly an answer to the question about accountability, but it is a way of trying to oftentimes when we think about trans and queer projects, we take for granted that we all mean the same thing when we use those words. And especially when projects are headed by white folks, and especially in my case, white trans masc folks, it's super, super important to deprioritize my experience of transness, and to create space for folks who have much more rich and complicated and nuanced experiences of those words and the systems that are designed to manage them.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a wonderful point. And I think, yeah, I think it's definitely a lot for us all to think about. Yes, I have been asked before exactly who gets counted, because my project is called the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project. And basically, if you're not comfortable with the gender of people assigned to you when you were tiny, you are welcome. And yes, we know that all the terminology would definitely shift. I have, this is sort of related to that, because I feel like my understanding of what it means to be trans writ large, not just that name, but really what it means to think deeply about one's gender expression, etc., has really grown over the time that I've been doing oral histories around this topic. And I'm just sort of curious if this is true of the rest of you as well. And you don't need to go into specifics about any one interview or anything like that. But for instance, I feel like I'm much more confident, excuse me, my cold again. I'm much more confident in a lot of ways. I feel like I'm a much more confident activist. I'm a much more confident advocate, having heard the stories of so many people. And in a certain sense, like we said, having taken on the care of so many people's stories, right? It's after the interview, I make sure everybody's happy with the product, how it looks on the website, that we remove things if later they decide that they don't want it public after all, and really just being that that caretaker for those projects. And I wonder, maybe Rae, we'll start with you again. Do you have any thoughts about the personal growth that comes with these types of projects? Um, Aiden, let me bounce this over to you, and Rae, I'm going to fix your audio for you.
Yeah, so I think, thinking back to when I first conceptualized this project, or kind of, I'm a Midwesterner through and through, and was in Chicago before this, and there's been a trans oral history project run out of Chicago, not explicitly about Chicago, but and a broader country project, but headquartered there. So yeah, I always wanted to get into trans oral history work from a younger age. And I think there wasn't the time and space to do it until I got to Iowa and a different level of need. And I think, to Myrl's point about the way in which we understand gender and trans identities and how that's even shifted over the last few years, not let alone the last, century, how we've understood gender nonconformity. I think as someone who is transmasculine and is a trans man who has a very normative monolithic narrative in my own life, it's pushed me out of my comfort zone to understand younger and newer generations of gender nonconforming people, and I have to be really honest about that. I think I grew up on the tail end of a generation. I'm been out for 11 years. And everybody that I had as a role model was an adult when I was a teenager. There were no, I couldn't find at least very public images or narratives of young people transitioning at the time that I was, until I discovered the kind of YouTube world at a certain point. But even then, everybody that I could meet in an urban space like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they were married and had kids and had so many other things that I didn't understand or know and share that experience. And so I had learned from them kind of how to be trans, and I've had to wrestle with that personally a lot of what does that mean now that I'm much older and have a different understanding of myself. And I say this because that has informed this project for sure. For me, as someone who's running it and the director of the Trans Oral History Project, that I've had to grow and push my own understandings of gender identity and gender nonconformity and what those narratives look like. Because I think originally it was easy to be on the hunt, I guess, or to find people that reflected my own experience and ask them to sit down for an interview or to invite them in to be trained. And so the more and more work that I've done in community, the broader my own understanding, even as a trans person, is of gender identity and gender nonconformity and how those narratives appear and kind of how to invite people in. So again, much like Myrl has already said so beautifully, we don't do the work, even in a trans oral history project, to define what that means, who's in and of the community. I think I've had to grow and listen to more people and learn how to invite more people in and kind of say yes without my own kind of preconception. So it's amazing to see and be really honest about how I haven't always maybe been the most inclusive historically in my own understanding of trans identities when I was younger. And this project has certainly pushed me personally to give people more space and more time to share their stories and to be a part of a community, and has really challenged me to look back at myself in critical ways, especially as a white trans guy running this project. So I'm thankful it's really opened me up and challenged me in personal ways, and I think built a really strong community, enough that we could launch a community archives and library here in Iowa City, right? And have relationships across the state. Like the Oral History Project and the relationships from that were the fodder and the I guess the ignition to knowing we have enough history here in this state to do this work, and that people are engaged. And we've already invited enough people in through the Oral History Project to go this next step and build a space. So stop there.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you, Aiden. That's very insightful. Ray, I believe your audio may be fixed if you'd like to share.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this question is stumping me a little bit today, and it might be because I'm like on the tail end still of a moving process. So I feel still like I'm in and like, I don't feel super like grounded looking back, but I also think some of it is that it's been such a like, some years I've had 2 months in the summer and some years I've had a weekend on opposite ends of the year. So there's been such inconsistency for kind of time with these oral histories and with these interviews until pretty recently. And like, I have changed so much in 8 years since starting this project. What is from the oral histories? What is not? Who knows, right? But I guess what is coming to mind is really, it's like less about queerness, it's less about gender, although it has been, of course, like amazing to hear. Also, I love to hear how people think about and talk about and find sexuality and gender in rural or small town or not major metropolitan spaces. But I really feel like I have learned so much about, for lack of a better word, like rural is such a complicated, there so many things fit into that word. And people have such different perspectives of what, when you say the word country, what that means, when you say rural, what that means, when you say small town. I mean, there are people who think, growing up in West Virginia, like our biggest city is a small town to a lot of people, right? And so like this stuff is so in some ways unpinned downable. And I love that about the project. I'm really interested in like in spaces that aren't New York and that aren't LA and that aren't San Francisco, but increasingly that aren't Durham or Atlanta or, Asheville too. Like I'm really interested in places that we just don't hear nuanced media about. And I will say that I think through the project, my guess starting it out again out of sort of just really needing it was that that there were going to be people everywhere and that our stories were going to have some moments of overlap, but mostly be really varied and really different across geography and like climate and like political dynamics of our counties or towns. And that's been true. And so I guess it's been such a gift to get to like learn so much about so many different kinds of rural and small town places, and how different places can be from one end of a state to another or from one end of a county to another.
Yeah, thank you for that. Amy and Myrl, would either one of you like to speak to this?
I think one of the things that oral history has me reflecting on is the power of listening, and and what it has meant for me just as a person to cultivate a capacity to listen deeply to people's stories. And it's something that I didn't, I didn't come into this project identifying as an oral historian. I used conversations with people who were doing movement-based work and wrote about them, but I didn't call that work oral history. And so when I came into the project, but I had been working in queer and trans social movements for a long time, and so it made sense because I, had these sort of movement connections, and the project was going to be focused on activism. So it made sense. But when I came in, I was like, I am a imposter and I know nothing about oral history, and let me read a whole lot and talk to people. And one of the ways that the practice is different than the work I had done previously is because it is so much less tactical. I was asking people questions for the purpose of writing a thing about activism. So I was asking them these very tactical questions. But oral history is really about honoring people's journeys in their wholeness and complexity, and is much less is much more unmoored in terms of it is expansive in this different way. And what it also means is that you have to hang in there with people. You have to cultivate the capacity in yourself to really be present for and with people as they go through really hard shit again. And because, as much as I don't want the archive of transness to be an archive of trauma. Also, the experience of gender nonconformity is marked by trauma. And so I am just really aware for myself at like how much I've had to work to cultivate the capacity for deep listening and the like emotional space to really be present with people. So for me, that has been a really important aspect.
Yeah, I just want to say that I really loved hearing everyone's responses to this question. I'll just add, like on a really personal note for me, the Mississippi part is one of the things that sticks out, like in terms of growth. I'm originally from Mississippi. All my family, like I was one of the few people that have ever moved out. My parents and I did when I was about 12. And after living in different parts of the country, I ended up getting a job in Mississippi about 40 minutes from where I grew up. And I grew up in a very rural area where a gas station was about 15 miles away from us. And it's actually fairly close to Tupelo, Mississippi. And I was a little anxious about being here, and it felt like familiar territory that I was an alien in at the same time. And so I had a lot of angst about it at first. And one of the things that I feel that this being involved in this project and getting to know the students who are from Mississippi or have ended up in school here and have grown to love it in their own unique way is to find a new relationship to Mississippi and who is Mississippi and what it is and can be. And that's been really important. And it's also been really important to think more critically about resiliency as a force of social change. So it's kind of the scholar activist part of that, is that hearing people's stories and kind of the hardships or the work that they put into living their day-to-day lives is inspirational, and to keep doing work even when it gets hard and it's really takes a lot of time and energy and it feels like it's going nowhere. And I think a lot of the students here feel that as well, and that's really important. I think about the Bar of Rumors in Shannon, Mississippi. It was a space for queer Mississippians to gather on a dimly lit country road. And the people who worked that bar had demanding day jobs. They would oftentimes open it up only on the weekends and have to stay up, till 4 or 5 in the morning. And then maybe on Monday morning, get up and go to work at 8 a.m. And so all that work that it was to just create that space for those couple of days of the week, just again, exudes resiliency as a force of social change. And I think that's the lesson I needed to know being here. And I appreciate that.
This has all been fantastic. And I want to be conscious that we have just about 12 minutes left. And there's so much that I want to talk about that we'll never be able to squeeze in. And so at this point, I want to ask all of our audience to start thinking about what questions you might have and to start putting those in the chat. And while that's happening, I would like to ask something that I wasn't sure I was going to ask because I didn't know how it would go over, but I kind of feel like we started to segue into it as it is. And so I'm going to ask if each of you would be willing to reflect on why it is you do this work. Right. So it's a lot of work. It's work that we could be doing other important things during, but we're not, right. We're working on each one of our projects. So I wonder if we could just say it briefly, just go around and just sort of talk about why it is that we keep doing this. And let me see. Aiden, do you mind if I start with you?
No, not a problem at all. Why I do this work? I can't help it. I don't know. Is one honest answer. I feel really called and pulled to do this type of work, and I think I have to blame my undergraduate public history professor. Amy Tyson, I'll call her out. She started this all in Chicago, and I started transcribing oral history as a service learning project, and it was this really incredible collection of African American oral history interviews from Evanston in Chicago, or outside of Chicago, suburb of Chicago. That was all great migration participants. They were senior citizens, and they were cassette tapes from the 1970s, and I think it is, and I bring this up because transcribing those with a foot pedal as an undergraduate in the basement of the Evanston History Center, on one hand made me fall in love with the human voice and the power of story, and that time and space to tell your own narrative. And so I think that's something that I've never been able to let go. I've just had kind of an obsession as an audiophile, admittedly, and as someone who is a historian, in oral history work, and it has been pervasive in kind of everything that I've done and the research I've done over my career, and the teaching I've done. I teach oral history in the college context, in community spaces. I'm invited to places across campus. Everybody at the University of Iowa knows if you've got something oral history going on, I'm going to be invited at some point to talk, and to say hello and guide people in the project. And I just can't, outside of pinpointing it to that moment in undergrad, like I cannot let it go. Like it's been a thread through my life. And I think for me, Iowa just provided the time and place to finally center the trans community in the work that I've been doing for over a decade now, or just about a decade. And so it was the time and place to privilege trans narratives, and I'm excited through this new project to burgeon into some broader queer oral history work as well. But I'll blame Amy Tyson. So.
That's fantastic. Amy, would you like to speak about this?
Sure, I'll say something briefly. I think that the Oral History Project helps break the silence and stigma that surrounds gender and sexual nonconformity in conservative contexts. And to me, this breaking is a feminist project that helps upend sexism, racism, heterosexism, and transphobia in the South. And that doesn't mean to say by any means that, for instance, the Tupelo project, where a lot of our interviewees were white and identified as gay or lesbian, are necessarily rallying cries for anti-racism. But I think that trying to intentionally have work and projects that are intersectional and bring these discussions to the forefront in this university is very important. And that's a lot of the reasons why I'm doing this work. I want to help make this place a place where everyone can feel a little bit more comfortable being weird, being a little different, stepping outside of the white, cis, gender, heterosexual norm, Christian norm that is very prevalent in this context. At least it's very dominant, politically, socially, economically. So that's why I do what I do.
Thank you. In case anyone's wondering, I actually just moved back and forth across where y'all are on my screen. Myrl, would you like to speak about this?
Yeah. So there are two answers to this question. The first is in part, I do this for this project because, for me, this project is sort of a part of a broader activist project. It's about trying to not let the strength and amazing intersectional radical vision of trans movements be pinned down into a focus on anti-discrimination law and we're just like you. All we want is to become to be included, which I think is what so much of mainstream conversations about trans activism is focused on. Basically, I don't want trans movements to go the way of gay marriage. I don't want the vibrancy of trans movements to be turned into a PSA with Janet Mock, as fantastic as she is, but someone who's super passable, young, conventionally pretty. I want the amazing richness and super radical politics of trans movements to be more represented in conversations about trans movements, in part because what trans movements are really saying basically is not, we want your pity inclusion, but we have a better vision for what the world should look like than you do. And actually you would be better off in our vision than you are now. Maybe y'all need to listen and see what the world could really be like. And so that you could have the kind of freedom to live your life with self-determination and joy that we want for ourselves as well. So that's sort of why I came to the project. But then once I did, I sort of fell in love with oral history as a practice, and as a practice that is about telling, building memory in marginalized and disenfranchised communities, the power of memory. And I'm still sort of thinking through for myself what that is. But I have caught the bug that Aiden has as well.
That's fantastic. And I love the way you framed that. Thank you so much. Rae, would you like to speak about this?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question a lot since we had our little planning call a couple weeks ago. And because I at least monthly have moments of like, what am I doing? And I think that that partially comes out of the fact that until like starting next month, this will never have been like part of my job. It will always have been something that I was trying to cram in outside of really intense other full-time jobs or school, while also being a rural queer person, which means, you know, in this particular moment, I am in week 5 of not having water. I have an outhouse. I have 17 animals. I have 2 goats who are pregnant. To get to internet, I have to drive 45 minutes, right? So like I've killed at least 2 cars over the course of this project. There are many reasons why I sometimes think it's, I maybe should stop, but, and I don't want this to sound sort of melodramatic. And I also, something afterwards, actually feel like there is still a piece of this project for me that is like still about personal survival in the place that I feel most at home and was raised in, but that also I feel very not at home in. And that like, I want to say that like as a white person who was raised middle class, I don't mean like material survival or like physical safety survival, but I do mean mental health survival, right? And like over the course of COVID, the number of rural queer people who have reached out and said like how isolated they feel, right? And I know that isolation is a theme of COVID, but I also think that isolation can be a theme of rural queer experiences. It's not, I don't like to make broad generalizations, but that's one of the only things that comes up in almost every interview, right? Is that like, we can feel like we are the only ones out here unless we drive however close to a city you are, you know, an hour to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 10 hours somewhere to be in places where people won't look twice at us, right? And so, I mean, I really think that's it. And then the other thing I would say is like, increasingly, I'm just so pissed off that nobody funds rural media. Like there are rural people who have the skills, who want to share our skills and who want to tell stories about rural communities that do not flatten our places into these like monolithic, stereotypical white Christian conservative straight scenes. There's some reality to that in some places, but like there's so much depth and richness. And there are so many radical histories of like organizing in rural places, and we never get that in national media. And so I guess I'll just say that is increasingly another piece of this project for me is like, I just want people to fund rural people to tell stories about rural places.
Thank you for that. And thank you everybody for all of these wonderful answers. We're just about coming up on time. We have a couple of questions. I'll go ahead and read them. We might go a little bit over. So if anybody does have to leave, let me just take this moment to thank you for joining us. So the first question is from Caroline to Amy. She writes, you mentioned finding different reasons to embrace Mississippi. Can you give a couple of examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'll try to make it brief because that's a big question. So embracing Mississippi, I mean, just since I've been here, I've been in Oxford and in this department, particularly for 6 years. And in that 6 years, we have had death threats to one of my colleagues for the anti-racist work that he does. We've had Breitbart News people, emailing us and telling us that we need to get rid of so-and-so in our department. We've had our chancellor condemn some of our colleagues' research before that we're doing anti-racist work. There's a lot to unpack with embracing. And what I mean by embracing, I think sometimes is, like to Rae's point, is to also see that can start to feel like that's the only Mississippi, or that's the only context or people that you're around. And that can feel very daunting, and it feels uncomfortable. But the reality is that that's not true. And I think doing this project and building relationships with students who are doing the interviews and listening to the interviews and thinking more carefully about what does this project mean in this context has made me helped me embrace Mississippi and see it in a different way.
Thank you. That's lovely. Those of us in similar locations definitely know what you mean. The next question I have is from Alice to Rae. Can you summarize what you feel working on country queers has taught you about the rural queer experience?
I would say the only thing I feel like I can summarize is that there is no rural queer experience, right? There's no one rural queer experience. That I think, as with like queerness, as with transness, as with these sort of broad terms, generally, like I think what's come up in everyone's presentations today is just how much these terms hold, right? And I think that's true for rural queer people. That there are so many variations about how we experience our places that we live, based on our own kind of layers of identity, but also based on the places, right? And so literally one of the only things that I tend to feel like I can generalize is that almost every person that I have interviewed has at some point talked about how much they hate traffic and don't understand why people live in the city where they like have to sit in traffic for hours. And this is generationally, but I will say that like dating is hard as a theme. So that's how I'll answer that.
Fantastic. I often, while sitting in traffic, ask myself that first question, right? And then what I'll read out here is another question from Caroline, sort of to everybody. And I know that this question can be a little bit complicated. So maybe if any of the panelists just have a quick thought on it, we'll take it. Caroline writes, does anyone have oral histories of queer or trans youth? Aiden mentioned something earlier about his age, which made me think of younger non-binary folks, excuse me, and children who are receiving more support because there is more openness in the trans and queer community. Parenthetical note here that I also expect to hear there might be issues regarding stories of those under 18. I know for my project, I have not done anyone under 18, mainly because it just hasn't come up. But I think also we would have to think a little bit more carefully about everything, obviously.
So can I take this one? One of the things that I think I am super cognizant of is that our project is this like a big university that's like has the model, like a much more sort of traditional oral history model that I don't love, where it's like an academic who goes like out into community and then like gathers up the stories and brings it back to a university repository. And in that context, I think like that's not the political context for oral history that I think that I am super invested in. And in particular, I think the best oral history are ones that are centered in the communities that they're documenting, right? So the New York City Trans Oral History Project is an example of that, but there are lots of others. And I could see an amazing project that young folks do with each other that has some like support around the technical aspects of it, and the archiving if folks want it to be archived. But I wouldn't want necessarily like a big university run oral history project to be like, you know, yeah, it feels ethically like murky to me. And that's not about devaluing the stories of young folks, but it is about like recognizing the power imbalance and dynamic. Yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
I'll jump in here as well. I see the message of summer camp. So I've done a youth-oriented oral history summer camp before. It's rad. Let me tell you, it's fun. I've gone as young as seventh graders through high schoolers is what I've done different oral history and digital storytelling with. A lot of them happen to be queer and trans and non-binary youth, even though that wasn't the theme of the camps that I did here in Iowa City with the Iowa Youth Writers Project, a local nonprofit. And it did at least teach me and make me think about some of these avenues for our work, which I think will flourish post-COVID with youth in particular. I'm fortunate in Iowa City, at least, there's a lot of youth-centered organizations that make space for LGBTQ youth in our community. And we're looking forward to partnering with them when everybody's back. But to Myrl's point, like we're a community-run oral history project. And so we don't have that same kind of institutional authority and maybe mistrust or worry in some contexts, since we are community run. So our hope is that when it is safe to do so with the youth, because they're already overburdened with Zoom school and stuff, like no, afterwards, we want to maybe either do a summer camp model ourselves that's explicitly queer and trans, and empower them to become interviewers and lead a full kind of youth-oriented project. But then this actually leads me to slightly like aside that the second phase of our oral history work, I mean, the trans work will always be going and continuous, is actually to start interviewing partners and parents and family members and other folks who show, allyship behavior towards trans and non-binary folks, which not a ton of projects have done from what I'm aware, looking through. And that's a space where we're going to be able to invite more people in as interviewers, right? So not just trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming folks, because we've had so many people who want to participate, and I'm like, well, we keep it in community. And so this is going to be the way that we'll branch out. And I bring that up because I've had a lot of phone calls with parents of trans and non-binary youth across the state amidst all the legislation Iowa's dealt with, which is luckily nearly all dead. Thank goodness. But I think opening space for parents not to talk about their child in particular, but about their narratives of becoming a parent of a trans youth and queer youth broadly is going to be a really, really cool and interesting aspect of the project moving forward that will still share youth experiences in a different way, but maybe not have the same precautions of like, oh, are you under 18? Can we publish this? What do we do to kind of protect those younger folks and their narratives too? Because we'll have to be really thoughtful and critical moving forward when we get the chance. So some of my thoughts.
Thank you for that, Aiden. Thank you, everybody who had questions. Thank you to our panelists. We are running right at 3:07 Central Time here at Latope World Headquarters. So let me go ahead and call it. Panelists, thank you so much. It has been absolutely fantastic. Everybody, thank you for coming out. Future watchers, thank you for making it to the end. So excited. This has been so much fun.